All right, so we are now recording. So Tim and I are both professors at CBC, and honestly, this is kind of what we would typically do on a regular morning is just go near each other's office and just kind of chat about different events. And obviously, with um, COVID incidents, we are unable to do that. But figured this was probably a big enough topic to kind of bring in, you know, our different opinions from our different expertise. So for those that don't know me, my name is Adam Austin. I teach in psychology at CBC. My background is in social and forensic psychology, and I teach both those courses and have partnered up with Tim on numerous endeavors, what we'll call them, in both general psychology as well as forensic psychology. And Tim's background is much more extensive than mine, so I'll give him the floor to share that.
Thanks, Adam. So my name is Tim Harris. I am the criminal justice instructor here at CBC. I've been there, well, it'll be 6 years come this fall. And like he said, my background's a little different. I actually attended CBC back when I bet most of you weren't alive. Anyways, and I got my AA degree in criminal justice. And from then I went into store security, catching shoplifters, employee theft, and that. And then I became a reserve police officer with Kennewick Police Department, was subsequently hired on in the early 80s. And I worked with them for 25 years in different aspects. Canine officer, I was a sergeant in charge of various departments. I became a lieutenant when I looked at, and kind of be relevant in when we start talking today, was internal affairs. Did that for a couple of years, and then I was promoted to captain, and I retired as a captain. And then I worked out of the prison at Coyote Ridge for a couple of years as a adjunct professor, and then I got hired on with CBC. Well, that's kind of a background of me.
Okay. So figure we would just kind of start this chronologically. And so, I think everything, I suppose we could actually go back to kind of the shelter in place because that definitely plays a role here. But let's just kind of start with the George Floyd arrest or apprehension and then eventual death. From my perspective and having zero field experience, having everything come from a textbook, I saw things that didn't look right in that incident, but I would much rather have somebody who was not only been trained, but has had to do it many times over, kind of give their thoughts on how was it handled.
Being a prior law enforcement officer and internal affairs investigator, sometimes it's really hard for me not to convey some personal ideas here. So I say that because I really believe in the integrity of the investigation. So I try not to Monday morning quarterback when I see various things on YouTube or the news because they only capture a piece of the incident. They don't capture before, and rarely we are seeing them capture what's happening after now. But this case is a little different just because of the video is so clear on this one. And I do not want to say, in my opinion, that this is racially motivated. I don't know that. I have no idea to that. I would sure hope it wasn't racially motivated. But saying that, I don't know. I do know the training that I've gone through and that I've been keeping up to date on in at least the Washington State Police Academy's training. The knee on the neck that you saw of Mr. Floyd and his ended up dying because of that. That is a legitimate tool. They used it wrong in that aspect of it. There's a saying in the police world, if you can control the head, you can control the rest of the body. So one of the training aspects of that is to control the head. And by doing that, you place your knee on the person's neck, um, hopefully in the back of the neck. But you got to be cognizant of, because everybody has carotid arteries that run here on the sides here. So any pressure you put on those arteries, and to the extent that it cuts off the oxygen to the brain, can cause the problems that we saw here. So the problems that I see just on that one incident of the officer putting the knee on the neck, they had him handcuffed. Why did they keep his knee on the neck? I don't understand that piece of it. It was way too long. The individual was saying he couldn't breathe. There's so many triggers here going on. The officer should have been going, oh, let me roll you over on your side so you can breathe. There were other people even saying, hey, you can't breathe. And I don't know the time limit. I think overall 8 minutes, but
That's what I've heard as well.
was it 8 minutes?
Yeah.
I just can't fathom that. It's no different than using a chokehold, and that's where you use your elbow here, right here, and you grab the person around the neck and you apply pressure here to the carotid artery there briefly to render the person unconscious. Now that used to be a piece of self-defense that we could use. It was called a level 2 self-defense. So it's the same as using your canine or your mace or your taser. But because it resulted in officers not releasing that, it caused death. If the person asphyxiated, no oxygen to the brain there. So that piece of training is still trained in the academy, the chokehold, but it's a level 3 under deadly force. I see no difference to the level that they use this knee to this Mr. Floyd's neck as deadly force. It cut off the blood supply, plus the other officers that were sitting on the handcuffed Floyd's, I think they're sitting on his legs and everything. He couldn't draw breath. We got a lot of different things going on there. And as a police officer, you got to be cognizant of all of that instance. Adam?
And so when, just for, again, I'm thinking I might use this in social psych as well, and we don't talk about the use of force continuum in that course. So when you're referring to level 2 and level 3, that's the use of force continuum that officers are trained. And ideally it's, you go one level higher when necessary, depending upon what the perpetrator has, correct?
Correct. And I'm sorry, I should explain that a little
Oh,
better.
no, that's fine.
Yeah. So there's level 1, level 2, and level 3. And there's also a 4th level called the cooperative level. And that's just showing up in uniform in a police car, hoping that people will disperse or stop doing what they're doing. Body language, verbal cues like, hey, stop it, knock it off, get down on the ground. That's cooperative. Then you go to level 1, which are escort holds and more hands-on. Level 2 is your canine, your tasers, your baton, those type of things. And then level 3, or the deadly force, is using your sidearm, using the chokehold, or any other method that you are using to protect yourself or protect others. And that's one thing I look at with this, and remember, I'm just saying the same thing you guys are. I'm just seeing that bit of film. But use of force means, yeah, you can go up to the use of force necessary. You can even draw your sidearm and use that, but you can also go down. And once they have somebody under control, as they did here, why didn't they de-escalate that down to just having him handcuffed, rolled over, put him in the back of the patrol car, done?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, and I think it is important to note that, we're both trying to be as objective as possible, right? I think we both have our personal feelings towards what we saw and what's happening, but our role as instructors is to do our best to just, here is the objective nature of what it is that we currently know. And with that being said, there's so much that we don't, right? And not only with George Floyd being, handcuffed, but then the aftermath is it's a puzzle at best, because you're getting so much information about different groups doing different protests versus rioting versus looting versus, conspiracy theories out there about people funding these things, and all these different things. And so absolutely something could break tomorrow, and it's going to start to change the narrative that we're having today. And so I think it's just want to make sure students understand that that we're using the best information that we have as objective as possible from our discipline perspectives when we're discussing this.
That's a good point. And also it's fluid, like Adam just said. It could change tomorrow. And who knows, because we're only getting what we get from the media and social media, unless you guys are actually out there in the protest or the demonstrations. And let me talk about that for just a minute, because I really, really, really believe in our Constitution, and I believe in our Bill of Rights. And the very first Bill of Rights is the right to free speech and public assembly, but it does say peaceful. And from what I'm hearing is that overwhelmingly, most of the people are demonstrating, letting their views be known about what happened, that tragedy that happened, and they have a right to assemble. They have a right to protest. They have a right to air their views, and I stand up for that 150%. It's those outliers that Adam was alluding to that get paid to come in and disrupt things and to take a peaceful demonstration into another direction, anarchy, where you're having looting and assaults and things like that. It really is a conundrum as a police officer to figure out, how do we handle that and still allow people to assemble?
Yeah. And before we move on to the protests, just from my perspective, watching the arrest video, there's multiple issues going on, and I think both you and I would agree, when you have four officers arresting a single individual, and one of them is obviously doing something that is against the books, but then the other three don't do anything, even when public demands are being made, that you can hear in the video, people yelling at other officers like, he can't breathe, he needs assistance, why are you doing that? And like, to me, that just screams culture, right? The culture of that group of officers is one such that the other three, for their own reasons, did not feel comfortable or did not feel right interjecting against the one with the neon. And that is highly, highly problematic in that occupation, is that if you feel like I can't speak up and I can't be myself in a group where you are relying on others to trust you, no matter what's going on, there's fracturing happening there. And I think that speaks to the larger Minneapolis Police Department. From everything that I've been seeing and reading, is that there's a split happening right now. And I don't know how you get back to that, right? Like, how do you get it back to being a cohesive group after all this is done?
It's going to take probably change of leadership is going to be one of the things, because it comes from the top down. So in any culture, and I use the word culture, I think Adam used it the same way. The police culture, there's a culture for attorneys, there's a culture for doctors. They all have their cultures and subcultures involved in that. And Adam and myself both talk about groupthink in our classes together, and we talk about that. And it's really, and I've seen it in the police realm. You don't want to rat on your brother or sister. They're the troops in blue, but there's also a moral compass. You take an oath. And this goes back to Rodney King, back in the days when the riots in LA and Rodney King. You had two officers beating Mr. King with their nightsticks, all filmed, and you had 3 or 4 other officers just standing around. Did they not know what they were supposed to do? Did they not want to interfere? It's hard for me to say, because I don't know what's going on in their minds. But for me, I'd be grabbing that guy going, dude, video cameras all over the place. We've got a person here. We need to, we've got the arrest done. Let's take over. get that person that's emotional. And I don't know if that was it in that case. The officer that I observed with the knee didn't look emotional at all. Um, so, but as being humans and being emotional, you can get wound up in the situation. And it's our duty as other officers to go in and go, let me take over. I'm going to take over this. Should have happened in this case, but I completely agree with what Adam said. I think it's the culture of the Minneapolis Police Department and those subcultures in there. And I don't want to put any guesswork on there, but I just listened to the union president of the police department say a few things and went, well, there's a problem right there.
Yes, and I guess for a little bit more background, I am from Minnesota originally. I'm sure some of you picked up on that during my speaking. And so I always contrast because I get people ask me all the time, like, what's different being in the Tri-Cities versus being, in the Midwest? And I typically tell them like diversity is the big difference of that experience. Now, for me, it's a little bit easier to say because I teach courses and, typically in social psychology, we're talking about all these issues. But I can say from, teaching in the Midwest in 2010 to 2014, I had numerous people ask me, don't you think it'd be better just not to talk about race? I feel like when you talk about race, that's when you have problems. And that's the mindset that I've run into, for most of my upbringing was that idea of like, you don't talk about race, just be colorblind. And it obviously doesn't work, is what all the research shows. Where here, I think I've been asked that maybe once or twice while I've been teaching, like, do you think we should really talk about race? Isn't it better just to leave it alone? But most people here have either had personal experiences or know somebody who's had a personal experience due to their race that they've been treated wrongfully. And I think that's why we see in Minnesota constantly, right, that we had the Castro case a few years ago where an unarmed Black man was shot by police officers in his car. Like that's why Tim and I are talking about the culture, because it's not just this one incident and then there was this uproar that happened from it. It's been documented time and time again. And the Rodney King incident, 92, I
Yeah.
think that
Yep.
was.
Yep. I believe
Uh,
you.
it's drawing a lot of comparisons, and rightfully so. But at the same time, because I've seen people say, well, why don't we just use the Rodney King playbook? Like whatever happened in 92 to dispel that riot slash protest, why don't we just do the same thing? It's a completely different game, right? That 92, you didn't deal with Twitter and Facebook and like just thinking of the human power it takes to actually navigate through all the different posts, all the different stuff from, because I know police officers do that now, but that's, it is amplified for them to try to figure out where is the next, looting going to happen? Where's the next protest that we should set up barriers for it? I mean, it's just jumbled up now.
Yeah, and as we're talking about this briefly, you look at the Rodney King. Even though there were uprisings a little bit across the nation, most of it was all centralized in L.A. Here, we're seeing, even though this happened in Minneapolis, um, we're seeing uprisings just as big as the protests there in cities all across the nation.
Yeah. And so from kind of moving to where we are now, when psychologists try to look at it, and this is going to be mainly social psychologists, like why do riots happen? Why do protests happen? I mean, it's two different things, first and foremost. And I think that's one of the confusion that happens. And I think I've even done it in this video, that I've used riots when I'm at protesters and vice versa. But absolutely, it's two different groups. And so the target, as Tim said, like, you have the right to peaceful protest. I don't think anybody's confused about why people are protesting. They're protesting because they feel like an injustice had been done, and based upon history, they're probably not going to see justice, is how people are viewing it. But the rioting is a very different construct, and many times over, people feel like they need to be in one box or the other. And personally, I say, no, you can say, absolutely, I support the full on protest, but I kind of don't feel comfortable with the riots that are happening. Like, you can be in that position. And from a psychology standpoint, we look at riots as something known as social identity theory, that every single person has a social identity that's made up of who they view themselves as being. So, for instance, when I think of myself, I view myself as being, a professor. I view myself as being a husband, as being a father. Myself as white, I know I am, right? Like, it's not news to me, but it's not that important for me as an individual. And, my wife, um, her heritage is Irish, and that is one of her top things. She loves the fact that she's Irish. That's part of her social identity. When you have somebody who has been a victim because of what you believe is their skin color and you identify with that skin color, you're ultimately going to lash out. It's going to become a very emotional thing. And when you have done protests for a long time and nothing's been done, or you've been told that's not the right way to do it, it has to escalate, right? And this is just human nature. Again, I'm not saying it shouldn't happen. I'm not saying that it should. I'm just saying, like, this is the cause, and that's what psychologists try to figure out, is what's the cause of this happening. And for police officers, they're kind of caught in the middle of all this stuff, right? That their personal views don't really matter to that big of an extent. Their job is to try to uphold what the law says. And we've seen videos of them doing very harmonious things with protesters, protesting with them, kneeling with them. There's videos showing cops that are lashing out against protesters. There's videos of cops fleeing from protesters, right? We have the whole spectrum covered. And so I guess kind of the big question that I would have for you would be, like, one, were there any protests happening that you ever had to take part in for protection purposes? And then, like, two, what is it like if you have had to do that?
Good question. And yes, I have. Right here in the Tri-Cities, believe it or not, it was during water follies. It's
Of
back in the
course.
day. Yeah, it's back in the day when it was the Wild West. Columbia Park was part of the county. It didn't belong to the city at the time, and was you had like we do now, Pasco side and the Kennewick side, and 100,000 people would show up to these, and they allowed camping down there. They allowed, basically, it was just a free for all. So picture in your mind Columbia Park during the summer, all the campers down there, motorhomes, drunken parties going on, fights, assaults, rapes. We had, this is kind of one of the turning points back then when Kennewick ended up taking it over, is there was a individual on a motorcycle that was racing up and down Columbia Park down there, and somebody had strung a clothesline across it, and it hit him in the neck and just about decapitated him at that point. So we ended up taking that over, and but the problem didn't stop. We still had, and believe it or not, 80% of the problem was people from out of town. It's Portland, Seattle, far away, would come here just for a big party. They'd wreak all the havoc they could and then leave. And I was a canine officer at the time, and two instances where we were called out, and we trained as canine officers. We trained with the SWAT team. They're the ones that threw the gas and had the big shields, and the dogs were in the back. We were called over to assist Pasco because Court Street was completely taken over by, well, they weren't protesting anything. They were just, other than the curfew, there was a curfew installed. They were just, they're shattering windows. If you look at Court Street now, there's a big thing that looks like an anchor. I think it's a Mexican restaurant now.
Yep.
On Court Street. Well, that used to be Skipper's, and that's where that anchor came from. And that was the center of it. There were people climbing on there. I had my dog with me. I had a 30-foot lead, and I would send him out. And what you try to do is you focus on the instigators. Most of the people are just there doing this, and there's usually 2 or 3 or 4 instigators that get people riled up. So as a police officer, you want to focus on those people. You do a line up like this. It's kind of a arrow shaped with officers on each side, and then I was in the back here. And you go through the crowd, grabbing those instigators and then bringing them back. And they threw gas. The police department threw gas. Rioters threw rocks, took those gas cans, tried to throw them back at us. Molotov cocktails with lit thrown at us. So yeah, my dog bit many a person that day. And then the next day I was home sleeping. It was a Sunday. No, it was a Saturday. That happened Friday night. It was a Saturday. I got a phone call that it was erupting on Kennewick side downtown. It was the middle of the day, for crying out loud. And there were like, oh, I don't know, 300, 400 individuals that were rioting, but they didn't have the rocks or the stuff they had up there. All they were throwing at us was seaweed. So we were able to commandeer that pretty quickly. But it can be, as a police officer, you got to think of you and your partner's safety in a situation like that. That's paramount. But also the people that are protesting, and most of them are just wrapped up into this. And Adam will be able to explain this cognizant reasoning of people, but they're not there to do violence. Most of them, they get wrapped up in it. It's those instigators. And as an officer, you still have to protect those people that have a right to protest and everything else, alongside of protecting yourself and trying to arrest or detain those that are causing the problems. And as I said before, and I think you'll see in this case, a lot of the arrests are coming from outside that area that's even protesting. They're hired. I don't know. Adam?
Yeah. So we have a term called de-individuation, which is where when you are either in a large group or you're wearing a mask, we've seen the effect happen there as well, you ultimately feel not yourself. And so you're able to take more liberties, right? And so if, and I've had this happen in a much more subdued, stupid way, that I had to dress up as a mascot for my wife's company. And I was I'm a very reserved introvert person in my daily life. And I will say, after about like 20 minutes of being in this full on mascot costume, I had a sign and I was dancing with it on Road 68 and trying to draw people in. That's not me, right? Like, but it was one of those things I realized, well, nobody knows who the hell I am. So might as well, if I'm doing this. And it's that sensation that takes over. And it doesn't always have to be deviant. Like, people certainly can do good in large groups and things like that. But certainly what we're seeing is more and more deviant acts. And we're also seeing, again, footage that it's just a snapshot, so we need to take it with a grain of salt. But where somebody begins to do something that is deviant and the majority ostracizes them, right? They kind of kick them out before they can break the window. Or, I saw one video where somebody's trying to break up a sidewalk so they can have, cement pieces, and they, push that person out and away and actually turn them over to the cops. Now, again, it's just snapshot, so I can't say like absolutely that is exactly what was happening, but I think it happens more than what we were seeing. Unfortunately, though, you can't prevent every single instance. And you're right, as soon as somebody starts to do something slightly deviant, you're going to get some people that are looking to, oh, wow, what could I do to one up that? Right. And it goes up. And we see it with, as dumb as it is, and it's something I still don't fully grasp, but like when sports teams win championships and there's, celebrations, quote unquote, that happen and turn into riots. And the one I always use in class is when the Philadelphia Eagles won the Super Bowl a few years ago. There is a guy that ultimately, because Philadelphia uses horseback mounted officers, guy comes across an officer who's on horseback and sees that the horse just defecated and decides, I'm going to eat it. Now, I can't imagine that guy woke up today and said, if my team wins, I'm going to go eat horse manure. But it happened, right? And so, like, that is, again, just one of those things that we call it de-individuation in large groups. And many people, they don't even really fully recognize what they're doing in the moment. Like, afterwards, they can think back and be like, wow, I actually did that, right? Like, how stupid was that? But in the moment, they're thinking, this is great. I'm a part of this large group. we're making something happen, we're celebrating, we're causing change. And so they begin to rationalize a little bit. And again, I can't say this is how every single incident of rioting, looting has happened in this kind of current situation, but I would argue there's a fair amount that that's what's going on.
Interesting. What about if we bring this back to the racial aspect of it when we talk about um, the racial piece of that and the differences between prejudice and you know what's the word I'm looking for here? Prejudice and if I can find it here. Oh, discrimination. Yeah, that was the word I was looking for. And biases. And I know you've done a lot of work on this, Adam, because we've talked about it in classes before, but the differences between,
All those
those two
terms.
things. Yeah.
Yeah, and honestly, like the way I look at them might not even be the way other social psychologists will look at it either. But the way that I was taught is that prejudice is an attitude, and so we have attitudes about major things, minor things. It's how we respond to stuff. Now, every attitude, and again, this is from kind of how I was trained, is made up of three components. That you have a affective component, or how you emotionally feel about something, a behavioral component, or how you act, and then a cognitive, or how you think. So discrimination falls under that behavioral one, that you're actually taking action because somebody's race is one that you don't like. And so you're saying, nope, you cannot be here. Nope, I will not serve you. And we see it with like sexual orientation, right? Anything that is a difference. Somebody could say, I don't like you because of this reason, and so I'm not going to do this for you, or I'm going to do this for you or to you, which would be a crime. But that would be the behavioral component. The cognitive component, we call that a stereotype. And so stereotypes, when we're talking about other people, typically are always going to be detrimental. And I know that there's going to be some people that are like, well, no, like there can be good stereotypes, right? Like, Asian Americans are good at math, or African Americans are great athletes. You're still boxing them all in, right? Like I can promise you that there's going to be an Asian American who's not good at math, or an African American who's not a great athlete, and you're telling them they're supposed to be, right? That's kind of the problem with saying, well, I'm saying they're good things about that group. Yeah, but you're still not letting an individual of that group be an individual. And there are some true stereotypes out there. I always use myself as one that there's stereotype white guys can't dance. Absolutely, I fit into that. That if you were like, I don't think you can dance because you're like, he's white. Sure, I do know white guys that can dance, but for me, that stereotype happens to fit. There's also one against white guys in golf, that white guys love golf. If it's a frisbee golf, absolutely, I'm in. If it's hitting it a little ball with a club, I don't get it. So no. But yeah, so that's the stereotype. And then with the biases, it's one of the things that I think the hardest pill people have to swallow is that we all have them to some degree. Because you happen to have a bias against a certain group does not necessarily mean that you are inherently an ist, right? So whether that's racist, sexist, ageist, any of the other ists out there that they can think of, it's what you do with it, right? So we have what's known as the implicit association test. I've also seen implicit attitude test, and it measures how are you on these different things. And I have my students take it in social psych, and inevitably I will have students that will say things like, I actually agree with the results, but I think the test is flawed, which is interesting to me, because I'm like, well, but you got what you wanted. They just don't like the idea that pressing keys on a keyboard is giving them how they view things. And then I certainly will have ones that are like, I got that I was this, and I strongly disagree with that. That makes no sense. And those are the students that need to kind of reflect on it. Like, why would you get it? If I were to take it and I got that I have a strong preference for white Americans over black Americans, it's not telling me that I am in fact racist. It's telling me that I grew up in a culture that has told me time and time again that white Americans are superior in some way. Maybe not in those terms, but I think of like my history classes. 95% of the time I was learning about white guys, right? Which it's like, all right, well, obviously people of color had to come in at some point and do things, right? Why aren't we learning about them? But it's more so supposed to kind of open eyes and be like, okay, you have this bias. What do you do with it now? Maybe next time you see a person of color, instead of kind of trying to look away or not make eye contact, maybe you just go up and say, hi, how's it going? And you start to change that and make it so that way that bias is probably still going to be there to some extent, but at least you're aware of it is kind of the idea. And you can have biases about anything and everything, but yet certainly race is the big one, especially in this scenario.
Excellent. And you talked about stereotyping, and it fits right in with police work too. And unfortunately, because we as a society paint pictures with a wide brush, these four officers that were involved in this death label police across the United States as not everybody, but it and I've seen it, pigs and let's all police officers are bad and everything, and in reality that's not true. um I think the statistic I have is 0.5% of officers that wear the uniform shouldn't be wearing the uniform at all. um, that's a pretty low percentage rate. Unfortunately, because of the instances we've been seeing over the years with African American being treated unfairly by white officers, and it's there. I've seen it. I'm not saying all of them were racially motivated at all. That's where we get into hiring and training. And I think that's a huge, huge piece of the puzzle. But labeling all police officers in that group isn't fair either. Um, they don't want to be involved in these riots. They don't want to be on the front lines, trying to deal with not only peaceful protesters, but the outlanders there at all. Now, are there cops that want to? Oh, yep, you bet. The meat eaters, we call them. And unfortunately, it is part of our society. And you're going to see that in every career or every job. You're going to see do you think that all attorneys are up and up and never do anything wrong? And no, you just don't hear about those all the time that screw up somebody's life savings and take off with it or whatever it is. And doctors that are performing some type of operation and are a little intoxicated, pilots or whatever. You see it as a blip, but you don't see the big brush stroke that we're seeing with police officers. Because why? Why do you think that is?
I mean, I think my best guess is power and authority.
Yep.
That it's always going to be anybody that has power and authority is going to be under a microscope for good or bad. And it's the expectation that officers are going to be good, upstanding individuals. So when they do things that fit that, you're like, oh well, whatever. Right. And I always use the example in class, and so I use it here too, that Kennewick and Richland, and I believe Pasco has now done it, but I don't know that for sure. For Christmas they donate money to allow kids, and I'm a board member at SARC, and so kids that have been sexually assaulted are the ones that I have been able to witness go and pick out gifts for, typically it's meant for themselves, and kids typically pick out things for their family. And I've seen officers open up their own wallets and say, you know what, here's an extra, $20, $50. That's great that you're picking out things for your little brother or for your mom, but I want you to get something for you as well, right? That's outside of this thing. And I've seen Tri-City Herald there and things like that, but it's not thing that I hear the next day or students talking about, like, hey, did you know that they were doing this at that Walmart or that Target? Because again, it's one of those things that that's the expected behavior, so it's not going to be as well documented as the unexpected. But when we do that broad paintbrush thing, you're absolutely right that it's easier to do that, right? To just say, I saw one person that fits this group do this, and so that's why I think they're all like that. Well, no, right? I promise you that many officers watched that video and they probably had two kind of conjoint responses. One was of disgust that it happened, and two, it was of anger because they knew the next steps were going to come, right? That before anything ever happened with protests and assembly, they knew shit, right? Like this is going to be a much bigger thing than, what people are anticipating, because they recognize it's not going to be isolated to those officers. And as you mentioned, there were probably some officers that were absolutely licking their chops, but like, great, I get to wear my riot gear, I get to go, shove people around. But is that the majority? I find it pretty hard that somebody's going to go through all the training to be an officer with the hopes of being able to kind of punish community members that they're meant to serve. Again, we both know that that happens, but I think it's unfortunate to label all officers that way, just like I would say it's unfortunate to label all of any group a certain way, right? That you have a wide spectrum of every single group. Doesn't matter if it's a religious group, if it's a social activist group, if it's a race group. You have the spectrum that people fall all over the place.
Yeah, good point. um, Getting back to the racial aspect of it, when we view these, like I said, I think at the beginning I was looking at this, and um, I have no idea if those officers were racially motivated in that. And I try to look at all of these, and there are some that I say, yeah, I think so. But the majority, for me, as a former police officer, I look at it like, no, I think it's a bad hiring and terrible training. Um, Under this aspect, I have no idea, and it may just be a culture thing that Adam talked to earlier. But as far as some of the other instances that we've seen over the years that appear to be maybe racist, for me personally, I look at that and I go, I'm not sure, but I definitely know it's a hiring issue and a training issue. And when I talk about that, when we talk about hiring isn't the same across the board for police officers at all. States and departments have their own system of running hiring, depending on where you're from. And we had a rush on, we needed police officers to be filled, and a lot of communities nationwide wanted quantity over quality. So some of those steps that were in there to reduce negligent hiring or hiring the wrong person were overlooked. And there are a bunch of cities and towns that don't even do some of the stuff they should be doing. Polygraphs, psychological, that are inherent in our business. Are they 100%? Adam can tell you no, they're not. But my point is that, are some of these things racially motivated? Sure, probably are. But I try to look back and say, could the department have done something differently? Should they do something differently? Now's the time for change. What should they be looking at? And I still get back to hiring and training. And when we have a downturn in an economy like we're facing right now, some of the things that go out the window are money for training. I've never understood that. That should be the highest priority. But it's one of the things they cut. And then they are trying to hire a bunch of people, and their hiring standards lower a little bit. And I'm not saying that around any of these cities that we live in here. It's, in fact, I don't even think that's true. They got pretty high standards of hiring and really high training. It's not like that across the nation.
Yeah, and I think that kind of brings us to next step, which is probably also last thing that we'll chat about. But like moving forward, how do we fix things? And I think you and I both agree that doing the protests are fine, it's within your rights, but we've seen that before. And again, from my viewpoint as a social psychologist, I look at all the other movements that have happened in the last decade. none of them actually fully achieve any substantial changes, right? It's a bunch of people that they feel empowered in the moment, and then it just kind of goes away, right? And for me, I will always think of like the Brock Turner
Oh,
case, the
yeah.
Stanford swimmer that sexually assaulted a woman, got convicted, which hooray, because that's fairly difficult to do in most sexual assault cases. And the judge sentenced him to 6 months. And as soon as that sentence hit, massive backlash. There was protests happening. And the idea was, all right, well, let's change the legal system as far as how do we actually punish sexual assaulters. Nothing happened, right? That I think he got out in 3 months for good behavior.
Yep.
And people are still upset about it, but we didn't see any systematic change. That's because, and this is where I think you and I agree, is that the systematic change has to happen with who's in positions of power.
Yep.
And that happens at the local, for police officers at least, that happens at the local level with elections. And we as a society typically don't care much about local elections. We kind of just look at the ballot, we look at what letters after their name, and we circle that. Or we write in some fun name as far as here, Icy Wiener can be, the comptroller of Benton County or whatever it happens to be. And instead, we need to actually, if you're looking to do change, you need to actually go to these different debates and town halls and things like that and ask those hard questions that reporters typically won't. Right? Reporters are not going to ask you, how do you, if police station is doing well, how do you maintain the level of integrity when it comes to racial issues in your police department? You haven't had anything happen recently. How do you keep that going? Or how do you prevent these things from happening, like what should have happened in Minneapolis? How do you not allow this to happen? What's your plan moving forward? Do you, are you going to propose training? Are you going to propose hiring changes and make them answer it? And then you actually will know, are we going to see a systematic change? But until we actually get to that point, protesters can do all the protesting they want. It has to be a cultural change that has to happen through elections, as much as people will hate hearing that. But that's the only way that we make systematic changes, is we get the right people in office that have visions similar to what the majority want, and they start to instill those visions and plans.
Yes, and I watched a video yesterday of Mr. Floyd's brother, who was speaking to a huge crowd, and he said some things that really, really, for me, said yes. And his words were, "Look how many people are out here right now. Look at the thousands and thousands and thousands of people across the nation that are wanting change and are upset about the what happened to my brother, but also systematically across the United States." And he said, "What we need to do is vote, 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 vote." And he said the same thing Adam just said. He said, "Vote at your local elections, your county elections, your state elections, and your federal elections. All of it are systematically. You want change? That's how it's going to be. Vote these people out of office if you don't like what they're going to say, or if you have somebody coming in new, police chiefs, sheriffs, councilmen who do hiring, the council and the mayors of different towns." He just said very emphatically, "We've got the numbers. Go vote. Let's start the change." And to me, I went, yes, that actually moved me.
Yeah. All right. Well, any other things to add? What was to keep it under an hour? I think we're at 15 minutes, so we're doing well there. So
Not that I can think of. Probably after we get done, we'll have many more. But if any students from any of our classes have questions, please let us know. Send us an email. We can even do another one of these Zoom meetings where we actually come on and answer your questions.
yeah,
That would work, wouldn't it, Adam?
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I guess just because I kind of ruined like the very poetic ending, we'll kind of revisit it with the idea of, if you want change, go out and vote and make sure that your voice is heard. It's the only real systematic way that we have, and it's worked in the past. we just need to remind ourselves that it's worked in the past. So
Yes, and the other part is both Adam and myself, and probably all the instructors at CBC encourage you to use your voice. Encourage you to get out there and show support for our African American friends and others that seem to be, um, because of the system we have, having issues. Use your voice, and you can do it in a variety of ways. Just don't do it violently. Don't get involved in that piece of it. Write your congressman, write your local people, get out and peacefully protest and share your experiences with others. I 100% agree with that.
all right. So yeah, like Tim said, any questions for either one of us, feel free to let us know. And if we get enough, we'll make another video. If nobody watches this, it was fun talk for us. So all right. Well, hopefully everybody still stays safe since we are still in a pandemic that's going on, which I know it's amazing how that gets kind of overlooked in the midst of all this. So
Yes.